The wine glass didn't shatter all at once. It kind of just crumpled. Like it gave up. 1 second, my brother-in-law was holding it, toasting to his own brilliance. And the next, it was in pieces on the travertine floor of my parents' dining room. Red wine bleeding into the grout like something that couldn't be taken back. That's the image I keep coming back to. Not the FBI agents at his office the following Tuesday. Not the moment my sister finally stopped defending him. Just that glass. And the look on his face when he realized who I was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is what I do, and what my family decided that meant about me. I'm a nurse. A travel nurse, specifically. For the past 6 years, I've been moving city to city, 12 contracts, picking up assignments in understaffed hospitals from Baton Rouge to Spokane. ICU mostly. Some ER when they needed the help. I've coded patients alone at 3 a.m. I've held the hands of people taking their last breath while their families were still stuck in traffic on the highway. I've made decisions in seconds that determined whether someone's father made it home for Christmas. None of that ever impressed my family. What impressed my family was my sister's husband. His name was Griffin. Griffin Aldwell. And from the moment my sister brought him home 4 years ago, my parents treated him like he'd descended from somewhere better than the rest of us. He ran a private equity fund out of Charlotte. He wore watches that cost more than my monthly rent. He had that particular kind of confidence that comes not from having done anything remarkable, but simply from never having been told no. My sister, Joanna, met him at a fundraiser. She was working in nonprofit development at the time, organizing galas for a children's literacy organization. And Griffin had shown up as a donor. He swept her off her feet in about 45 days flat. They were engaged by month 3. My parents were beside themselves with joy. I was living in Phoenix at the time, mid-contract at a Level I trauma center. I flew home for the engagement party and walked into my mother's kitchen to find her already deep in conversation with Griffin about interest rates and portfolio diversification. Like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to talk to about it. She barely hugged me. That was the beginning of understanding how things were going to be. Griffin had opinions about everything. About my career choice, specifically. The first time we were all together for a family dinner, he asked me, with genuine curiosity, not malice, which almost made it worse. So travel nursing, that's like, what, you couldn't get a permanent position somewheres? I explained that I chose travel nursing, that I liked the flexibility, that it paid well. He nodded the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. My dad, sitting at the head of the table, laughed a little. She's always done things the hard way, he said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. Just matter-of-factly, like my life was a mild inconvenience to the family narrative. Over the next 2 years, Griffin became the son that my family orbited. He and Joanna bought a house in a gated community outside Charlotte. My parents visited them constantly. My dad went to watch football with Griffin on weekends, drove 3 hours one way, something he'd never once done for anything in my life. My mother started using words like portfolio and liquidity in casual conversation. And me? I was still out there. Contract after contract. I'd been in Memphis, then Albuquerque, then a 6-month stretch in rural Montana that I actually loved because the patients were real, and the mountains were enormous, and nobody cared what your brother-in-law did for a living. The thing is, I didn't hate Griffin. Not at first. He was charming, genuinely. He could make anyone laugh. He remembered details about people, brought things up weeks later that you'd mentioned offhand. What you said your dog's name was, what college you'd almost gone to instead. That kind of attention feels like being loved. It takes a while to realize it's actually a tool. I started noticing things around year 2 of their marriage. It was small stuff at first. Joanna calling me late at night more often than she used to. Not really saying anything was wrong, but also not sounding right. Laughing a little too quickly when I asked how things were. Changing the subject when I asked about their finances, which she'd never been secretive about before. Then she mentioned, casually, that Griffin had asked her to transfer her 401k into an account he managed. For better returns, she said. He knows what he's doing. I didn't say anything. I wish I had. The dinner I told you about. The one with the wine glass. Happened in November 2 years ago. It was my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, and everyone had come home to celebrate. Joanna and Griffin drove up from Charlotte. My cousin and his wife came in from Richmond. And me? I'd just finished a contract in Nashville and had driven straight through to get there in time. I pulled up to my parents' house in my 2019 Civic with a duffel bag and a casserole dish. And through the front window, I could already see Griffin in there, holding court. Everyone laughing at something he'd said. My dad met me at the door. He looked past my shoulder at my car in the driveway, and then back at me with this expression, not cruel, just tired, and said, "You know Griffin offered to get you into one of his funds. You really should think about it. You can't travel nurse forever." I smiled. I carried my casserole inside. Dinner was fine. The way family dinners are fine. Functional, surface level, everyone playing their assigned roles. Griffin talked about a deal he was closing. My dad asked questions with the enthusiasm of a man who had found, late in life, the son he always wished he'd had. My mom kept refilling Griffin's glass. After dessert, Griffin stood up to make a toast to my parents. It was a good toast, actually. He had a way with words, and then my cousin said, "Griffin, we should talk. My financial advisor has been after me to diversify. Maybe I should be talking to you instead." And Griffin laughed and said, "Sure, absolutely," and launched into a description of his fund's returns over the past 18 months that made everyone at the table lean in a little closer, except me. Because 3 weeks before that dinner, I had been in Nashville. And I had met someone. Her name was Daphne. She was a hospital administrator, mid-50s, sharp as a tack, and we'd become friendly over the course of my contract there. We'd gotten coffee a few times. She had a way of talking about complex things simply, the way people do when they've been inside something long enough to stop being impressed by the jargon. One afternoon, she asked me where I was from, and I said Charlotte area, and she said, "Oh, do you know anything about a fund called Aldwell Capital Management?" I went very still. I said that was my brother-in-law's company. She looked at me for a moment in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Then she said carefully, "I have a friend at the SEC." She mentioned it, that's all. Probably nothing. I thought about that conversation for 3 weeks. I turned it over and over the whole drive home. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't have anything concrete. I didn't want to blow up my sister's marriage over a coffee conversation and a vague reference to a friend at the SEC. So I sat at that dinner table and I listened to Griffin talk about his returns, and I watched my cousin nodding, already half sold, and I kept my face neutral and said nothing. Then Griffin raised his glass for the toast, and my dad looked at him the way he used to look at me when I was small, before he decided I wasn't going to be the thing he'd hoped for. That's when the glass slipped. I don't know if Griffin's hand was sweaty, or if he'd had too much wine, or if it was just one of those small physical failures that happen for no reason. But the glass hit the travertine, and it broke, and in the second of silence that followed, everybody looked at Griffin, and Griffin looked at me. Really looked at me. The way someone looks when they're trying to place you. I'd cut my hair since the last time I'd seen him, and I'd been wearing scrubs every time I was home for the holidays, always rushing from some shift somewhere, barely present. But that night I wasn't in scrubs. I'd actually dressed up, nice blouse, the good earrings my grandmother left me, and I must have looked different enough that it took him a few seconds. But he placed me. I saw it happen on his face. A flicker of something. Recognition, but not the good kind. The kind that means you've been recognized by someone who knows something you don't want known. I didn't understand it at the time. I thought I was imagining it. I wasn't. 6 weeks later, my sister called me crying. 2 investigators from the SEC had shown up at their house. Then, 2 days after that, federal agents. The fund had been under investigation for over a year. The returns Griffin had been reporting to investors didn't match the actual performance of the underlying assets. He'd been moving money between accounts in a way that looked like returns, but was actually investor funds cycling through to give the appearance of growth. The word the investigator used, Joanna told me later, was Ponzi adjacent. Not a pure Ponzi, but something crooked enough to bring the full weight of federal securities law down on him. 32 investors. Total losses of around $19 million. My cousin was one of them. He hadn't called Griffin at that dinner by accident. Griffin had been cultivating him for months, Joanna told me. Sending articles. Mentioning performance numbers casually. My cousin had wired $300,000 2 weeks after that anniversary dinner. My sister didn't know. I believe that. She's not someone who could have watched our cousin's face at that table and known. She's not built that way. But there were things she'd ignored. Things that had felt off, and that she'd explained away. Because Griffin's was confident and charming, and because love, sometimes, is the most effective blindfold there is. She filed for divorce 4 months after the investigation became public. Griffin's attorneys tried everything. Argued the losses were market-related. Questioned the methodology of the SEC's accounting. Brought in expert witnesses to muddy the water. Griffin himself, in interviews and in the few public statements his team released, maintained a posture of wounded innocence that was so convincing I almost understood for a second how 32 intelligent people had handed him their money. But the evidence was what it was. Federal prosecutors don't bring charges they're not confident about. He pled guilty to 2 counts of securities fraud, 1 count of wire fraud, 16 months before sentencing. The sentencing was 8 months ago. 7 years, federal prison. Minimum security. Yes, but 7 years is 7 years. My parents didn't talk about it for a long time. My dad, especially. There was a period of about 3 months where I'd call home, and my mother would pick up and give me updates on my sister and on how they were managing, and on the attorneys, and on my cousin's situation with the lost money. And my dad would be there in the background, not getting on the phone. Just present. Quiet in a way he'd never been quiet before. He called me himself for the first time in I don't know how long on a random's Tuesday in February. He said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make it easy for him, but I also didn't want to make it harder than it needed to be. He said, "I spent a long time being impressed by the wrong things, and I treated you like your work didn't matter because it wasn't the kind of work I knew how to value." He paused. "You were right about your life. You made the right choices." I held the phone against my ear and looked out the window of my apartment. I was in Denver by then. New contract, an oncology floor that was absolutely breaking my heart and building it back up at the same time. And I thought about all the dinners. All the times I'd driven home and walked in and felt invisible. All the Sunday calls where he'd asked about Griffin's fund before he asked how I was doing. I said, "I know, Dad." And I meant it gently. He didn't know what to do with that, I could tell. He'd prepared for more resistance, maybe, or more hurt. He said, "I just want you to know." I said, "I do know. It's okay. It's not entirely okay. I want to be honest about that. There are things that happen in families that don't fully heal. They just scar over, and you learn to live around them. But I'm not interested in carrying anger that costs me more than it costs anyone else. I've watched enough people in hospital beds to know that time is not a thing to waste on grudges." Daphne, the administrator from Nashville. We stayed in touch. She texted me when the sentencing came out. Just said, "Saw the news. 7 years. How are you holding up?" I told her I was okay. Which was true. My sister is rebuilding. She's back in nonprofit work, actually. Found a position at a housing advocacy organization in Raleigh. Moved closer to some friends she'd drifted away from during the years with Griffin. She sounds on the phone like someone who has been through something heavy and set it down. Still tired sometimes, but lighter. My cousin recovered most of his loss through the investor restitution process. Not all of it, but enough. He called me after the settlement came through and said something I didn't expect. He said, "I knew something was off at that dinner. I felt it and I ignored it because I wanted it to be real." And then he said, "That's the most expensive lesson I've ever bought." I think about that a lot. How much we pay for the things we choose to believe. I still travel nurse. I'm in Denver now, like I said. Before that, Nashville. Before that, Spokane. I've been doing this long enough that I have a routine wherever I go. The coffee shop I'll find in the first week, the running trail, the good Thai place. You make a life out of small consistencies when the big ones keep shifting. People ask me sometimes if I ever want to settle down, get a staff position, buy a house somewhere, maybe, someday. But right now I'm okay with being the person my family never quite understood. The one who shows up in a Civic with a casserole dish. The one who took a call from a hospital administrator in Nashville and filed it away in the back of her brain and waited. Patience, I've learned, is not the same as passivity. You can be quiet and still be paying attention. You can be overlooked and still be exactly where you need to be. Griffin is in a federal correctional facility in Cumberland, Maryland. He'll be there until I'm well into my 30s. The watches are gone. The house is gone. The fund is dissolved. The investors are in various stages of recovering what they lost. And me? I clocked 12 hours last Tuesday on the oncology floor, held a 71-year-old man's hand while he called his daughter's name, drove home in the dark, made scrambled eggs, and slept like someone who had nothing to prove. That's the whole story. That's what happened to the nurse who just traveled around, couldn't settle down, didn't know what she was doing. I knew exactly what I was doing. I just didn't owe anyone a performance of it.